Welcome back to Saruwatari Xtreme. Today we're back on the 7, specifically the endless fuel system. To save time, I reassembled the regulator. So I'll just give you a couple pointers that really help me out. The first is, when you're going to assemble, if you have access to a vise and you can use soft jaws, that is the best way to get the top of the regulator centered and assembled easily. Now, the number one problem I usually always have in the field specifically is the diaphragm. So what I always do is, even here in the shop, is I'll use heavy-duty silicone, spray it on the top side of the diaphragm. That way when it comes down, it allows the diaphragm to move and center itself in the cap. If you have to do it in the field, the best way is to use something like a wood block or something that's not going to mess up anything in the bottom of the regulator, and put all your weight over the top of the regulator and have somebody else put the hardware in. The other thing is the hardware. This is an all aluminum body, so you have to be really careful. So to go down real light, I usually always use a little bit of red Loctite. You'll know if you're over tightening the hardware because the diaphragm starts coming way out the side, but it's a real light touch. So now that everything is assembled, let's go ahead and go back to the front of the car, and I'll just tell you a couple things. Okay, some things to point out for all of you that are just getting into this stuff. Whenever you're working with AN fittings, which is primarily what we use in the fuel system, do yourself a favor and spend the money to get the AN wrenches, because they're aluminum. For one, they don't mess up the fitting itself, so they look nicer, which is always key. But really the reason why is service life. The AN fittings, especially the aluminum ones, have just a certain amount of service life. They distort, and once you blow through the anodizing, especially if it's aluminum fittings on both sides, they will tend to gall and lock up and seize, and pretty much your fittings are done. So you want to extend the life of them as much as possible to save yourself some money. So AN wrenches are one good thing. The other thing is always using a light coat of oil. You don't want to use too much because you really don't want a lot of oil in the fuel system. But what I always do is, I'll just set this guy down right there, with some light oil before assembly. Just put it mostly on the threads and just kind of move it around just like that, just like this. And this is real common practice. A lot of you already know this, but those of you that are just getting into this, it can save you a lot of money in the long run. So if it's just enough to lubricate everything, put that back here. Okay. The other thing to watch for is the end fitting seals right there. That's the sealing surface. When you go to assemble, just make sure it looks concentric. Everything is uniform. Otherwise, you could potentially have a leak, and oftentimes they just leak, at least in my experience, because the key is you want to tighten them down so they won't leak, but no tighter than that, because you're reducing the service life. All right, so what we want to do is we're going to put this in position here. The hardware there. This right here is a return line, and it was put on with a quick disconnect, so it's just like an air fitting in your shop. Just pull the collar back, and these are really handy. Okay, once it's locked on, you're good to go. Now, the reason why we don't use that everywhere is they're prone to leak. And on the pressure side, man, you just don't want any leaks if you don't absolutely have to. So right here, we talked about the sealing surface of the fitting. Again, just a little bit of oil. Okay, there we go. Send them on. All right, now that the lines are on, we have the plug for the fuel pressure sensor right there. We'll put it on. Our manifold vacuum source, which is right here. Now, I'm sure all of you know this, but those of you that have naturally aspirated, most of the time you don't have to do anything to secure. But if you're changing from naturally aspirated to some sort of forced induction for the first time, you always want to use something to secure this line. Because remember that as boost climbs, the regulator is increasing your fuel delivery. So if this line was to come off, that is a whole world of hurt. Okay, all right, so we got that. Now we'll just position this. Everything looks good. Harness is cleared. Come inside here. And okay, now that the regulator is tight, again, the AN wrench. Now I'm just going to snug it down because, like I said, we will always test the system when we pressurize, and I don't want to go any more than I have to. All right, that being said, the regulator's in. Let's go ahead and move forward. Let's move on to the injectors. Now you'll recall I pulled the injectors and sent them to RC Engineering. They were turned around very quickly, but we've been held up with all sorts of other projects. So I just can't stress enough that this is such an important part of the project. Now, RC Engineering was one of my sponsors, and I called them and told them that I would be happy to just pay for this to be done. But since they remembered me and we had a good relationship, they said they'd take care of it. But the important part about that is that no matter what, I would have paid them to do it. This is the reason why. When you send your stuff down to a good reputable company, they're going to take care of and test everything. And what you'll get is a report. Okay, this report, take a look at this. This is what was going on. 3 of the injectors were completely locked closed. One was only putting out 907 cc's per minute, but it was dripping. Okay, so you get this full report. Now, take a look at these injectors. They're all new because they wouldn't take any chance. That's definitely a major plus. Like I said, I'd be happy to pay for it. But they'll make the call and they'll make sure you get the right stuff. Now, take a look at the report of the new injectors. Even the new injectors, they're numbered, you probably saw it on the cap, and the report tells how close they are to 1,000 cc's per minute, but there is a variance. So if you look, number 3 puts out just a hair more, then it would be 2, 4, and 1 the least. Now, the RX-7, this isn't a huge deal because it runs a Motec, so I can trim every injector. But because I know that the 7 typically almost always loses the rear rotor. Everyone has their own theory. I believe the rotary god thinks it's because of the weight of the flywheel on the back of the eccentric shaft. It doesn't matter. What matters is I can tell you practically that most of the time it's a rear rotor that goes. So on the Motec, I can adjust the fuel, and I always run more fuel to the rear rotor housing. But for those of you that can't trim your injectors, this is key information. And the reason why is you would want to run the injectors that put out just even a little more fuel in the rear rotor housing. That's the way I would do it. So even just for good measure, I'll still do it that way. So what I'll probably do is most likely put number 3 in the primary rear and then number 2 as the secondary in the rear. And then in number 1, I would run number 4 and 1 injectors. That of course gives me, it's a mechanical way of getting a little bit more fuel to the rear housing since I know it's problematic. So let's go ahead and get ready and we'll put the injectors back in. Now that we've got our plan together with the injectors, we're back here at the engine. I've laid everything out, of course keeping track of my notes there so I know for sure where we need to send things. We'll just start by opening everything up, and once I give you a little bit of information that might just help you when you're putting this together, I'll speed all this up so you won't go through the painful agony of me being very careful not to drop anything in there and get everything in. See a little bit of debris there. Okay. So on the injectors, we'll start with the primaries first down below because they're harder to get to, and everything's laid out just like we talked about. Number 3 for the rear housing. The main thing on the injectors are you're just going to go back in the same way. Some people like to use engine oil. I don't. I like to use grease. It's debatable, but I've been through a lot of fires, for better or for worse. I've survived all of them, but I will tell you that every now and then the oil is just not thick enough and it clips the O-ring. Fuel shoots out anywhere near the manifold over here, all of a sudden you are a flaming ball of fire. It's bad times. I've had much more success with grease. So I will use Mobil 1, and any sort of good quality grease is good, okay? And when you put the grease on, do not get it in the orifice. It'll plug up the basket, okay? So you just want to make a real thin coat on that upper edge and none in there, okay? And then just down here, it's not really a problem, of course. Okay, so we go down here and put this in on this side. This needs to be plugged in, which of course says leading to, before it goes back into the boss. Okay, all four are in. Here's what you want to do. Learn from my mistakes. Sometimes the connector gets dislodged. Pull on every one of them to make sure your connections are good. Make sure they don't back out at all. Okay. Then slightly move all the injectors and double check the clips so they seat themselves with the O-ring and they self-seat, okay? Yep. Yep. Okay. All right, so as you can see, all the injectors are in now. So where we're at now is I'll explain something to you that can possibly help all of you. If you're doing injector work, I have not experienced this, but I've seen it firsthand in Abel's car at races. New injectors will come from RC Engineering, Motec, anywhere he gets them. They'll be tested, they should be ready to go. He'll put it in the car, and for some reason, they won't fire. So I always recommend testing your injectors, because once you close everything up, if you have to get back in there, it's a ton of extra work. So luckily, the Motec has the ability to test the injectors. So for all of you that aren't running a standalone engine management, most cars, even the factory computer, when you turn the ignition on, the injectors will cycle. So you could do the same test by having an assistant in the car and cycling the ignition. So what I'll do now is I'm going to turn on the ignition to the 7 and power up the M4. Now, most of you that are very familiar with this, make sure you have battery power on the car. That always creates all sorts of other problems if your voltage falls off. So let's see if we can get in. Now, I've already downloaded the software onto this computer with Simon's help. The problem is this computer is the NSX's computer, and the M4 runs on DOS, so it has to use a very old laptop that's not readily available, and the DOS simulators do not work because the M4 is so old. So I'm a little bit in a tough spot there. Let's see if we can get into the system. So we're having some issues. Okay, so now we're into the M4, and what we'll do is go into the Injector Test menu. This also is really good if you have standalone engine management, because you can double check that you've connected everything correctly. All right, so of course we get the warning. All right, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna set to run number 1 primary first. You can hear it cycling. That's a good sign. We'll feel right here. Okay, it's correct. Now we'll go to primary number 2, which is on the rear housing. It's going. Good. Secondary number 1 on the front. Good. And secondary number 2 on the rear housing. All set. Okay, now let's talk about what would happen if one didn't fire, which is what I've seen happen on Abel's car. What you would do is you would pull the injector and then hit the injector with 12 volts. I've seen him do it time and time again. It's amazing. Fixes everything. He puts it right back in, double checks it, ready to roll. But it's a huge savings. You put all that together, I mean, you're basically screwed. So that's a good test. That'll help out a lot of you out. I highly recommend you do that, especially when you're in there before you close everything up. Well, it has been a very long, hard day, but very productive. So we're at the point now where at least everything on the front side of the fuel system is closed up. And I'm quite happy about that. The injectors tested out great. You guys saw all that. Now, I always am tasked with what am I supposed to translate to all of you? And that's difficult because there's a wide range of all of you. But I do recognize that there's a lot of you that are building your own cars that want me to just give you information. And there are a lot of you that know almost everything that I'm conveying. So the only way to really do this is to cover everything. And the bottom line is that when we look at what was done here today, unless you guys are building a drag RX-7 or some sort of race car RX-7 rotary car, a lot of this stuff may not really apply directly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it down for you, okay? If you guys are going to be building a rotary, I suggest you buy the best components possible. So specifically what worked on today, the fuel pressure regulator, the injectors. There's a lot of different things available. And oftentimes I always tell you, I'm a huge proponent to save you as much money as possible, but specifically on the rotary, you want the best chance possible of not losing the engine. And the reality is, at least for me, by the time I hear this car detonate, even when it was a street car, the engine was gone. On a piston engine, like the NSX, so much more room for error. We can hear detonation, I can pull it down, there might just be a little bit of damage, a little bit of evidence on the top of the piston, nothing like the rotary. And for that specific reason, if you were building a rotary, I would buy the best components possible, go to the best places to give you the best possible chance. It will cost more, but it will save you in the long run. I guarantee that. Even with the best stuff possible, I've probably rebuilt the various engines in this car over 50 times in my career. And believe me, if I could spend any amount of money to reduce that when I was racing, I would have. But it's a different story if it's a piston engine. There's a lot more room for error. You could possibly consider maybe going with a lesser regulator that is very reliable. But when you look at components like that, always be thinking ahead. Save yourselves money. I've done a lot of projects where I wasn't thinking far enough ahead and it came back to bite me. For example, with the RX-7, the SX regulator. If you're going to be even thinking about methanol in the future, make sure your regulator, your plumbing, everything's compliant. Because if it's not, when you go to change, you have to upgrade. A good example is a fuel pump. I ran an SX fuel pump. It was quite pricey. But immediately when we considered going to methanol, had to change to Weldon. And then, of course, you have to size the pump to make sure that it's right for the system for how much power you're going to make. Plus, have enough room because, as most of you know, methanol consumes about twice the volume of gas. So always be thinking about the future. You want to have a good plan laid out before you start. It's just going to save you an immense amount of heartache. So if you want to take anything away from me, that would be it. When you're doing your own projects, anywhere you can, I always agree, save money. But the higher you go, meaning the more performance you want, the closer you get to the threshold of maximum, the better the components you need to have. So if you're at the bottom scale, where your car's factory and you're just going to make a little bit more power, if you're turbocharged and you're only going to run 3 or 4 pounds of boost, that's one thing. But if you're going to max everything out, my advice to you is just spend up front to save yourselves on the backside. And that's the best thing I can convey to you, and that will translate on all vehicles, not only this vehicle. So I hope I did a decent job of that and interpreting what you guys want to hear and see and learn from me. If I am not interpreting it right, what I suggest you do is comment below and tell me. That'll help guide me and I can give you the information you're kind of looking for. I'm going off of what information you guys are conveying to me. So please remember, comment, subscribe, thumbs up. It helps the channel out a lot and I greatly appreciate it. Other than that, thanks for joining in and I'll see you next time.